My name is Tanya Damle, and this is my video presentation for oral presentation number 1, No Country for Old Men. In this specific text, there are 3 particular phrases that I found to be untranslatable, primarily because they are not grammatically correct in English. They use colloquial English terms and eliminate articles, and the structure of the sentences puts not only removes articles, but it also puts the puts the nouns after the adjectives, which is not something that's done in Spanish, and in doing so would make it very difficult to convey to the reader the original meaning behind the source text, because it would be grammatically incorrect and would confuse the reader. So in these 3 phrases, for in particular, young as she was, wasn't no passion, and I never had no great desire, I made them grammatically correct in by modifying them to she was young, or there wasn't any passion, and I never had a great desire. This prevents the reader from misinterpreting the original meaning behind the source text. In with regards to register, this entire this entire paragraph and the text as a whole is written in a very informal tone. It is a conversation between 2 characters in the movie, and in particular, this specific section, sections 1 through 17, sentences 1 through 17, is a monologue given by one specific character as to how he's retelling his experiences. So to fully and efficiently translate the text without translation loss, one must consider the cultural setting in which it was taken, primarily because No Country for Old Men is a text set in the Wild West, which really speaks to the cultural gap. The use of slang terms and syntactical fragments speaks to the fact that both the translator and the reader must, the translator in particular, must use tú instead of usted to efficiently and properly convey the informality of the text as a whole. Moving on to cultural gap, as I mentioned before, No Country for Old Men is a Western crime drama that was released in 2007. I also believe it's a book. So, a Western is a film genre meant to convey life depicting the American Wild West, where cowboys and outlaws just kind of ruled they ruled the area in which they lived, because it was deemed very lawless, because it was a frontier where people were exploring. And so understanding the background of the source text will really help the translator and the reader identify the tone and provide a frame of reference for the ideas presented by this text. So in the text from No Country for Old Men, there are 2 more ideas that need to be discussed: modulation and connotation. Modulation is using a phrase that's different from the source text in the translated text to suggest the same idea. In sentences 1 through 17, this is represented by the phrase "he told me out of his own mouth." While this could be deemed untranslatable, that's not necessarily true, which is why I categorized it under modulation, because the literal translation of "he told me out of his own mouth" to Spanish is me dijo por su propia boca. So, based on context clues, the reader could have probably figured out that we're literally trying to say "he told me himself." But to make the sentence flow a little bit better, and to make sure that there is no translation loss and the reader doesn't misinterpret the original intent of the source text's phrasing, I changed it to "he told me himself." This also, moving on to connotation. Connotation is an idea suggested by a phrase. So in particular, I kind of used a block quote, and it says, "He killed a 14-year-old girl, and I can tell you right now, I never did have no great desire to visit him, let alone go to his execution, but I done it. The paper said it was a crime of passion, and he told me there wasn't no passion to it. He'd been dating this girl, young as she was. He was 19. So in this particular section, the author of the source text wants to tell the reader and the translator that he wants to convey the severity of the killer's crimes, and how the character speaking these sentences wants to distance himself from the killer and his actions. Having this background allows the will allow the translator to understand exactly what the synonyms to which synonyms to use in order to better convey the idea.
Hi, my name is Madison, and I translated sentences 18 through 35 of the provided text, No Country for Old Men. While I was reading this text, I realized that it had some dark undertones and it had some dark themes, and that was something to take into account while I was translating it. So the part that I specifically translated, it was about a sheriff talking about the people that he comes into contact with every day at his job. It talks about him watching someone be strapped to the electric chair and then preparing to die, and then how he talks about people who claim they don't have souls. And he even talks about, a prophet of destruction. And, it's all pretty dark and kind of just dark and scary. So that's something to keep in mind when you're translating, when you're setting the tone for the translation. And another thing that I noticed while I was translating it was there was a lot of grammatical errors, and the use of slang was very present throughout all of it. And one thing I thought that was really interesting was that even in the text, like words like don't didn't have an apostrophe. So like, I don't know, I just thought that was really interesting. Um, so the use of the slang and the grammatical errors, that actually, it kind of, you had to take that into account while you were translating, because it wouldn't have made sense if you translated it directly. So one of the key terms is are things being untranslatable. It does not directly translate. So, for example, he said might have instead of might have, and that does not make sense. It doesn't make sense in English, but in Spanish it definitely wouldn't have made sense. So I had to change that and then translate it from the corrected version. So similar to that, he wrote wasn't nothing instead of was nothing. So I had to change it to was nothing and get rid of the double negative before it would make sense when I translated it to Spanish. So another example would be them eyes instead of those eyes. Yeah, so just fixing that before you can translate it to Spanish is something that I had to do. Along with like little phrases being untranslatable, there were also like sayings that didn't exist in Spanish, so I had to change that as well. For example, in English we have the saying, the eyes are the window to the soul, but in Spanish they have a similar one, but it's not identical. Instead they say, los ojos son el espejo del alma. So instead of window, they say mirror. So I had to change that, take that into account when I was translating it. And then also, so the following sentence after the sentence about the mirror, I had to change it to say something about how the eyes reflected that instead of the eyes showed that, just because it would make better sense. So yeah. And then another example of that would be the phrase coming down the pike. It doesn't have a translation in Spanish, but what it basically means is English is like what's coming in the future. So I just translated it to make it better make sense. So I just said in el futuro when I translated it. So another thing that I dealt with when I was translating was modulation. So that's using a phrase that is different in the source language and the text language, but it still like says the same idea. So instead of saying he was not hard to talk to, I translated it to mean he was easy to talk to in the Spanish translation. And the phrase I'd as soon as not know, that's confusing to me to understand in English, so translating that to Spanish, I didn't think that was very smart to do, so I just said I won't know in Spanish, just because it flowed better and it still says the same idea. Grammatical transposition was also present when I was translating. For example, this happened when I translated "called me sheriff" to "El me llama sheriff." So that just like, like you have to rearrange what the object is in that sentence and how "may" and "sheriff" are now both the object. That was something to take into account. And then the final key term that that helped me when I was translating this text was cultural gap. So what I found was like at first glance when reading it, you probably like if you're not from Southern Texas, you might not have any idea what they're even saying. So just doing the further research and like clarifying that this like you come to find out that this is set in Southern Texas in 1980, and it's about a sheriff and talking about his job and like the people that he comes in contact with every day at his job, and yeah, so those are the key terms that I use to help me translate this text. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Connor Nelson, and I had the third section of the text to translate for my group. Um, yeah, this was an excerpt from No Country for Old Men, and I definitely it was definitely an interesting experience translating the text for for all everything that how it was written, as informal as it was, into a Spanish translation, um, because the portion that I had, as well as the entire excerpt, is written very informally with lots of slang terms. You kind of can't help but like have a southern accent in your head while you're reading this text, because you really get thrown into the actual dialogue of the narrator, and you can tell exactly where this narrator is from, um, his personality just by the way that he talks, and the informality of the text itself. So yeah, I was able to apply this translation to five different terms. Um, Starting off with untranslatable, there were a few things that did not directly translate or could not be directly translated into Spanish. There was a phrase that includes Southern language and slang. It's a not to sound glorious about it or nothing. That's the phrase, not to sound glorious about it or nothing. Um, so that in itself cannot be translated directly because it's not a very cohesive phrase. It needs to be changed to something more cohesive and formal. The second phrase was "I wish that it was." That right there, I wish that it was. When I translated this directly, it doesn't. If you take those words, put it into a translator, it translates into a cut off sentence in Spanish. It's like it's an unfinished sentence because I wish that it was dot 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 blank. It doesn't say anything, and it needs to have a concise ending for that to be an effective translation. The second term was modulation, and that's when you're using a phrase that's different in the source text and traditional and the translated text, to suggest the same idea. For that, I use the phrase "it ain't just being older," another one of those terms that's used in Southern slang. Um, and that, to me, that translates into the more common phrase, "it's not just me getting older." Because the original phrase would not translate properly into Spanish, due to the slang native to Southern American culture. It's not just me getting older would be the proper or more familiar style of the original phrase, and it easily translates into the Spanish "no es porque está envejeciendo." Um, a second phrase that I used modulation for was "not to sound glorious about it or nothing, but you do." uh, because it's a similar style with the Southern language. It would the more proper way to say this, or the more familiar way to say this, would be I do not mean to sound glorious when I say that, but that's how it is. When it's um when it's translated as is from the original phrase into Spanish, the result does not have the same meaning as the source text. The original phrase is translated into no pare de sonar glorioso sobre él, pero así es como es, which means it does not stop sounding glorious about him, but that's how it is. And so, by changing the original phrase into a less informal version, the Spanish translation becomes more coherent and the author's original message can be communicated a little bit better. Um, the third phrase that I did was register, which is the degree of formality in the language. And yeah, for all intents and purposes, this text was not written with formality in mind at the time of writing. The author is obvious about his informal use of dialogue to include slang, contractions, and like I was saying, you can't help but read the text with a southern accent in your head as you go along. In order for this piece to be translated into coherent Spanish, a good amount of rewriting has to take place in order for the translated text to have the same connotations as the source text. This means taking each sentence and tweaking it to ensure that the Spanish translation does not mislead the reader from the original intent of the author. Four was cultural gap, and that's when context is provided so that the reader can better understand the translated text. Um, and so I just tried to provide a little bit of context on what this excerpt was referring to. And from what I can tell, this excerpt is either a conversation between two individuals, or it's the narrator addressing the reader themselves. After reading the whole text, the reader finds out the narrator is a sheriff talking about the people he has arrested, the dangers of the job, and the toll it can take on a person after a while. From my portion of the text, the narrator is talking about how his job as a sheriff requires him to always be ready for the possibility of death. The context of this is that the narrator is a sheriff in 1980s southern Texas, and this allows the reader to understand the slang and tone that's used in the text. And the fifth and last one that I did was connotation meaning, which is an idea suggested by a phrase. And so for this, I use the phrase or a series of sentences saying, I think it is more like what you are willing to become. And I think a man would have to put his soul at hazard. And I won't do that. I think now that maybe I never would. That whole thing right there is a quote from the excerpt. Um, and I believe that this is in reference to the narrator's occupation. Um, the narrator is saying that the job they have as a sheriff is a hard one, and it's not for the faint of heart. After a while, this job can make someone cynical and lose hope, possibly even corrupt their values and beliefs. But the narrator has been through enough to know that becoming a different person because of their job is not an option for them. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elena Cassidy, and I did the last section of the translation for our group for the script No Country for Old Men. I think it was sentences like 54 through 71, so like the last little bit. I had a little bit of trouble with this translation just because it's so colloquial. There's a lot of slang in it, and there's a lot of abbreviations, which we'll talk about in just a second. But basically, I just tried to approach it with the understanding that it wasn't necessarily going to be like the same affect that was understood in the Spanish translation that I was creating. And I just approached it as best I could that way. So I did have a few problems. The first one, as I said, was with the slang. The person who is doing this monologue, they say things like "heading off," and they say words like "em" instead of "them," and they're saying "they was" or "them too," and it kind of led into this problem where I had to decide what tense I was talking in throughout my translation. And I used context clues to figure it out because it wasn't super difficult, but it did make it a little bit interesting doing the translation just because it was such like an Americanized version of talking, I thought, from the United States. And it was also just a translation that was full of divergent thinking. There was a lot of like little run-on sentences or like tiny little short abbreviated sentences. It wasn't, what would be considered like proper sentence fluency for an official paper or anything. So I have 5 terms that I picked out applied to my section of the translations from our key terms throughout the semester. The first one is untranslatable, something that just doesn't directly translate. The best phrase I could think of for this is the phrase "heading off" that I mentioned. in the first sentence he uses it, and it doesn't mean exactly like what it sounds like. So I had to use context information to figure out he meant kind of like keeping away. Again, those phrases like they was, I had to turn that into there was, or them two had to become those two. It was just like little things like that that I had to consistently do and make sure were being, consistently done throughout my translation. The next one is register. So that's, the degree of formality when you're talking. The entirety of the English piece of it from my section and the whole thing was super casual. This guy seemed like he was just kind of divergent thinking. He was just talking as he wanted to talk. He was in the middle of a monologue, and he was speaking in really quick words. He had those abbreviations that I mentioned. And I think my Spanish translation, because I did have to adjust those tenses and make some of those words change, it did become a little bit more formal. It was really obvious with the English version, like he was talking to someone that he knew. So I think the Spanish version still comes across like he's talking to an acquaintance or a friend. It just may not be as chock full of the slang that was originally in the English version. And then modulation, so that's using a phrase that's different in the source text than compared to the translation text. So the first sentence, I have my translation pulled up. So the first sentence says, not that I've done all that good a job at heading it off. I was a little confused about this, if I'm honest, but through context, I determined he was basically trying to connote this idea that like he hadn't done a good job at like keeping off this evil, this darkness, this crime, these criminals, things like that. So in the translation, I said, no es que haya hecho todo buen trabajo manteniéndolo alejado, which translates a little bit more formally to read, not that I've done all that good of work keeping it away. So again, you just got to change those phrases. Fourthly, I have a cultural gap. So context to provide the reading a little to make a little bit more sense. I looked up this book and I've seen the movie, so I was understanding the fact that in the English version you're talking about 1980s like Texas Mexico border. You're talking about an area that probably has like a mix of both English and Spanish in it, and I think that the location and the time reference kind of provide the context of why he speaks like he does. The people in the movie, I know it's a criminal. You have like a bounty hunter. You had the lead guy. So the type of speaking kind of follows the quickness of the movie and the time period in which the movie and the book take place. So I think that's important to understand the overall translation, because otherwise it is seemingly random. And then lastly, connotation meaning. So an idea suggested by a phrase. With that first sentence where he says, not that I've done a good job at heading it off, it just keeps getting harder. I determined that to mean, he's not doing, he's trying his best to keep this evil out to do his job, but it's getting harder. And then that's when he launches into this discussion about how these two boys randomly met and decided to start killing for no reason, and a woman put her baby in a trash compactor for no reason. And so I think what he was trying to connote, because he doesn't say it explicitly, is like he's not really doing his job well, even though he's attempting to, and he's not really stepping up to the plate as much as he should. And he uses that context of the two boys that are criminals and the mom who kills her child as kind of like supporting evidence as to that fact. So that was my section of the translation. Thank you so much for listening.